Hi, my name is Danielle. I'm an occupational therapist at Helping Hand Center. Today's group is the handwriting group, group 1 for parents. And basically the purpose of this group is my team reached out to our clients and our families that we treat at our clinic, and we asked, what kind of stuff are you guys looking for? How can we help during this time of COVID-19 and shelter in place? And one of the things that was asked for was a tips and tricks on handwriting and a handwriting group. So this group is geared towards parents and helping them understand the basics of handwriting, the basics of teaching handwriting to their child. My experience with handwriting, I have taken the Handwriting Without Tears course, which is a continuing education course offered to OTs and educators. I'm a four years OT, so I've been doing handwriting with my kiddos and making handwriting goals and structuring handwriting activities for the past 4 years now. So I have lots of experience working with children in handwriting. And then I also have done many in-person handwriting groups with children, and then those were print groups, and then I've also done a cursive-based group with older kids. So I do have a background with handwriting knowledge. So we're going to move on to the PowerPoint that I prepared. This just basically is just a visual of everything that I'm talking about and something that you can go back and reference. So this is group 1 of our handwriting group. So today's agenda, we're going to start with just a brief introduction, go over some of the more nitty-gritty biomechanical things that we see with handwriting, and then kind of the rest are going to be tips for you guys, where to start, tips and tricks, and how to work on handwriting skills without actually writing. All right, so the first thing that we're going to talk about is the biomechanical components of writing. So here I have a Twitter post from, and she's an educator, of two hands. The first one on the left is a developed or mostly developed hand. And in the post she wrote around the age of 7. So this is what most fully developed hands look like. Our 7-year-olds and above, including adults, typically have hands that look like this. And then on the right is a early child hand. So EYFS is what she referred to this hand as, and that's a child in the age range of 0 to 5. So this is a younger child's hand. So if you look at those two and compare them, you'll see that there are several bones that aren't developed yet in the wrist. There are joints and muscles and bones and ligaments that aren't fully formed yet. The hands look considerably different. We move on to the next PowerPoint slide. It kind of breaks it down even further, with the first hand on the left being more of a toddler hand, and then progressively getting more and more developed. So this, I just wanted to start with this because once the kiddos get to a certain age where writing their letters is expected of them, we often expect them to jump from I'm writing the basics and making these lines to all of a sudden I'm writing full-on words or writing my letters perfectly on the line or whatever it is. So I just wanted to break it down that kids, there is a developmental continuum of writing, and the reason why is because our hands aren't fully developed. Our younger kids below 7 are actually missing bones, and they haven't developed all those joints and ligaments and muscles and everything yet. So there's a considerable amount of development that needs to take place in order for our kids to be able to write with the ease of an adult or an older child who may be 7. Further moving on in the biomechanical components of writing, I wanted to talk a little bit about grasp. Grasp is a huge part of writing. It's a huge part of what we look at as OTs. And I just wanted to first show you those pictures of the hand so that you get a better idea of why grasp looks different depending on where your child is at. So depending on their age, or sometimes kiddos, they haven't developed, they might be older, but they haven't developed that grasp pattern yet for whatever reason. There could be many reasons. So why their grasp looks the way it does. So if you look at the top picture and look at this first one here, they call it a cylinder grasp, but it's more commonly known in the OT world as a fisted grasp. So 1 to 1.5-year-olds typically show this, and then 2 to 3-year-olds typically progress to a digital pronated grasp. And these are typically the grasps that we see in our early colors, the kiddos that we don't really expect too much out of right now. It's just we want them to scribble, we want them to color, and we typically see these kiddos moving in and out of these two grasp patterns. And then as kids get older, they start developing a more refined grasp pattern. So we have our modified tripod grasp, and then we have our tripod grasp. So those three, I call them my three magic fingers, 3 magic fingers on the pencil or marker crayon. And those are the functional grasp pattern. And then I have the figures below to kind of show you that there are many different grasp patterns. Some are more functional than others. There are a lot of functional grasp patterns. Don't think just because your child doesn't have a perfect tripod grasp or a perfect dynamic tripod grasp, as seen in some of these pictures, that they don't have a functional grasp. Functional grasp is a grasp that allows your child to write effectively without having pain, without being slow, with being legible. So that might look different just because all our hands are different and the way our bodies develop is different and the habits we develop are different. So as an OT, I look at grasp as, is it functional? And I look at function as, is the child slow with their writing? Are they having any pain when they're writing for a long period of time, or and that kind of stuff? If they are, then I would say the grasp is not functional, and that is something that I would want to target in therapy, because we might have an early writer, 4, 5, 6, that their grasp might not be functional, but it's not really bothering them that much. But then we get to our later writers that I start to worry about, because when they're expected to write the longer sentences and paragraphs for an assignment for school, they are experiencing a lot of pain and joint discomfort, and that leads to more problems down the line. So we definitely pay attention to grasp. Where to start? So kind of back to our letter writing, writing letters versus drawing letters. I feel like this is the perfect point to start on, because I do notice that a lot of our writers, especially our early writers, draw their letters. And the difference between drawing a letter and writing a letter is that kiddos they're drawing that. You can give me a child's name. So let's say our kiddo's name is George, and I see the final product and they look exactly the same. The first one, the child wrote their letters, and when they wrote their letters, they used proper letter formation. So that second bullet point there, proper formation versus approximation of letters. So we started all their capital letters at the top, because we start all our capital letters at the top. They use the proper formation when making all their other letters. Versus the second child, the names look exactly the same, but the second child drew their letters, so that they were able to approximate the letter perfectly. They were able to write George, and it looks like George and it's legible, but they drew their letters, so their letters do not necessarily start in the proper place, and they're not necessarily following the typical patterns of writing that. Writing letters has been studied very thoroughly, very extensively. So there are evidence that there is a certain way to write letters and it's the most effective way. So the kiddo who drew their letters, they're having a harder time, they're approximating a letter, they're not properly formatting it. So even though they look exactly the same, the speed might be affected. The child might be experiencing hand cramps. There could be some joint issues. There could be many different reasons why they're drawing the letter versus writing it. And then sometimes in that example that I just gave, the legibility wasn't affected, but sometimes it is. Sometimes our kiddos who are drawing their letters aren't able to approximate the letter correctly, and teachers are reading it and they're writing the answer to their test, and teachers are reading it and they're like, I don't know what this word says because the letters are close, but there's too many of them that are a little off, and suddenly the word doesn't make sense, and the kiddo's not getting points on their test or whatever the case is. So we as OTs pay attention to visual motor integration when it comes to proper formation of the letters, often called VMI. So that is basically how well your hands and your eyes are working together. Are you able to use your hands and eyes together in a coordinated way to create proper letter formation, to create the letters properly? So VMI is something that we talk about a lot. It's a way we have standardized tests that we can do to test VMI. It's something that we look at often. We write goals about VMI and function. So it's something that we can look at as a very standardized, very scientific way of figuring out why a child may be writing or drawing their letters versus writing their letters. So before we move on, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here, and I want to talk about letter formation with this example. So this is something that I did even when I was a student, an OT student, and we were talking about writing. So I have example 1, and then I have example 2 down here. Example 1 is starting my lines from all random different orders. So I was starting top, bottom, and I was just I was trying to make lines as fast as I can, and I was going up and down, up and down, up and down. So as you can see, when I kind of took a chaotic approach to where I started my lines are kind of all over the place. As I got further and further, I started coming off the line and going below the line, and it's a lot. It's messy. Whereas example 2, I completed at the same speed, but I started all my lines at the top. So I went down, down, down as fast as I could. And as you can see, the lines are spaced a lot better. They are a lot neater. There's less floating in the air. There's less going drastically under the line. So as you can see, example 2 is a lot cleaner than example 1. And the reason is we're going to talk in future groups, we're going to talk about capital letters and all of that, but we start all our capital letters at the top. A starts at the top, B starts at the top, C starts at the top, so on. And there's a lot of evidence as to why. And this is just kind of a crude example showing that we proper letter formation begins at the top for capital letters, at least. And there's a reason. It's neater. I could write for longer without going all off the line and getting all messy and stuff. So there's a lot to be said about proper letter formation and learning that early, because once you start a habit of writing your letters a certain way, that's when it becomes a habit, and that's when it's hard to break, and that's when writing doesn't become fun for kids. So it's good to early on teach them proper letter formation so that it becomes a solid foundation and something they can build off of. Share my screen again here. So that was the line test, and I encourage you to try it yourself. Try down, up, down, up, down, up, and then try down, down, down as fast as you can, and see which one is neater and nicer for you. And then just kind of wrapping this slide up, I want to touch on the benefits of tracing. Not just letters, anything, complex shapes, a flower, trace my flower, lines, jagged lines, curved lines, circular lines, all over the place lines, shapes, pre-writing shapes, the diamond, the square, the triangle. Having kids trace is a huge help when practicing the proper letter formation, just getting them more aware of their bodies, more aware of where their pencil is going. It just helps with that awareness piece. If kids don't have awareness, they're not going to get letter formation, and they're going to draw their letters. And so tracing really helps with that writing component, and it can be done in really fun ways. You can have them trace all these crazy different shapes, something motivating. If they're really into a certain cartoon, have them trace the cartoon characters. It can be fun. All right, so next, where to start writing progression. So I made this chart for you guys just to kind of understand. This will be something, it's pretty complex now, but something to look at later based on where your child's at. But it kind of breaks down based on grade level, or again, age, developmental age, where what the kiddos should be practicing, and how to progress. So as you notice, our kiddos that are more either new to writing, so pre-K, age 4 is typically when we start introducing letters. We wouldn't want to do it too much sooner because they just don't have the hand development to do so, and it's going to frustrate them. But typically around age 4, we start introducing our capital letters, and we'll start introducing the letters in their name. Around this age for their name, I like to use capital letters and keep it consistent. We don't want to confuse the kiddos by adding a pre-K and kindergarten. I typically try not to confuse the kiddos by adding in those lowercase letters because they're not learning them anywhere else at this point. And it might get too confusing. If they're ready to move on to learning those lowercase letters in their name, go for it. But they're still struggling with their capitals. We want to keep them at their capitals. But we have our pre-K, they're learning their pre-writing lines and shapes. We'll go over those a little bit later. They're learning their capital letters. They're starting to learn the lowercase letters in their name. But again, if they're not ready for it, don't push it because it's going to lead to confusion, and it's going to lead to drawing letters versus writing them. They're learning numbers, and then they're learning how to write short words. And then the progression through kindergarten, first grade, second grade is listed there as well. So this is just kind of an idea. And I mean, don't really pay too much attention to the ages of the grades at the top. If your child still needs a little bit of extra help with the pre-writing lines and shapes, don't feel like just because they're in kindergarten or first grade that you shouldn't be practicing that. If they don't have these foundational skills, they're not going to be able to move forward with their capitals and lowercase letters. So this is kind of just like a guideline. It's not a hard rule for every kid. All right, so challenges we typically see: a helping hand, letter formation challenges. We just went over that. That's huge. Spacing between words and between letters within a word. Sometimes letters are on top of each other. Sometimes words are on top of each other. Or there's too much space in between. Line adherence challenges. The words and letters are floating way off the line. They're not attending to the line at all. They're not showing any awareness of the line. Letter sizing challenges. We're actually going to talk about that today in our tips and tricks section. Letter reversal challenges, and then general grasp pattern development challenges, which we kind of already touched on. All right, so where to start pre-writing strokes and shapes. So these are the foundation for handwriting. Again, going back to that chart we just chatted about, when our kiddos, even if our kiddo is much, much older and doesn't technically fall under the area where we would be working on these pre-writing strokes and shapes, if they don't have them mastered, those are our foundational skills. We need to know how to make our vertical and horizontal lines, or circular lines, crosses, diagonals, squares, triangles, diamonds, because those things are going to feed into our ability to make complex letters. And getting these shapes down, they're simple. They're shapes. We've been talking about shapes since they were little babies. This is a square, this is a circle. They can recognize it much, much easier, and there's far less of them. But if you look at all these shapes on here, these shapes are, if once they master these shapes, they have the lines that they need, the angles, the different lines to be able to make the more complex letters, of capital letters, which we go pre-writing strokes to and shapes to capitals. Once they master these, they have the ability to make all their capital letters because they have those lines. They have the ability to make them in a coordinated way. And if we practice with these shapes and these lines and master them, there's far less of them, and they're way more recognizable than letters, which they're just learning, and it's already confusing for them. And now you're adding a ton of letters, and you're adding a ton of, every letter is different, and it's just a lot. So we want to always go back to these foundational skills. If these aren't mastered, they're going to struggle with letters. So just keep that in mind. And then also keep in mind that these are also developmental. So just like our grasp pattern and just like our hand development is developmental, so are different strokes and different lines. So if your child is 4, but they're not, struggling with connecting diagonal lines for certain letters, don't be too worried yet, because they're just developmentally appropriate for that diagonal line, and then connecting them in a coordinated way, that doesn't happen until age 5 when they start to do that diamond. So there's certain letters that are harder than others, and just keeping in mind the pre-writing strokes and shapes and that developmental continuum will help you realize like what letters are going to be a little bit tougher for your child and what's appropriate. All right, so we are going to touch on developing hand stroke skills and pre-writing a lot more. Each group that we film, we're going to talk about how to develop hand skills. So today's group, we're going to talk about multisensory, and I'm going to give examples for that. We are going to talk about fine motor, and a future group, gross motor ways of developing hand skills for pre-writing. But I still threw this slide in here because I just wanted to reiterate that so much development towards handwriting comes from non-handwriting related tasks. So your child is not going to perfect their handwriting just by writing. There's so many functional play tasks that are going to help with development of writing skills. So, and again, those are multisensory, fine motor, and gross motor. So today we'll talk about multisensory, and then the rest of the groups will talk about other things. But think back to that picture of the developing hand and think of what needs to happen to get that hand developed. It doesn't just happen. I mean, maybe some of the bones and some of the muscles might just develop on their own, but we, just like our bodies, that we, adult bodies, and in order to strengthen our bodies, we need to work. We need to do things with our bodies, and whether that's just everyday things or we're going to the gym or whatever it is, we don't see progress unless we work towards it. And for kids, their biggest occupation, and me being an occupational therapist, I'm going to talk towards this, their biggest occupation is play. So we really need to push different components of play to help with development, and that's going to help with handwriting. So a lot of times I see kiddos that, their biggest form of play is that screen time, and they're not necessarily playing with all the connective toys and pulling apart, pushing together, all that kind of stuff. They're not hanging from the monkey bars or climbing the rock walls or weight bearing on their hands as they're crawling on the floor to make a fort or whatever it is, and they're really, really struggling with writing because their hands aren't developing, and they're not gaining all that muscle and everything they need. So they're fatiguing very quickly. They're struggling with writing. So I just want to reiterate that there's many, many components to developing hand skills, not just writing over and over again. You work on many different things. All right, so we're moving on to our tips and tricks section, and I want to chat about letter sizing today. So for our pre-K kids, pre-kindergarten, we just want to focus on writing the letters and proper formation. So it's totally fine if their letters are huge, they're taking up the entire page. We're not necessarily too concerned about lines yet. We can give them lines to work with. That's completely fine. But if they're, their letters kind of hanging off in space, that's pretty typical for their age. Kindergarten, first grade, and beyond, these are the kids start to develop a sense of a home base. They're starting to recognize their baseline, and they're starting to begin to put their letters and their words on that line. And so the kids are developing a baseline, but we also need to talk about the lines themselves, the boundary lines. So there's a baseline, but then a lot of times there's also a tuck line. So we want to make sure that the lines are appropriate for where they're at, and then we want to help them get progressively smaller. So if we want to provide the proper just right challenge for our kiddos, and we kind of want to meet them where they're at to initially start practicing. And once they start practicing their writing, and once they start getting writing and letter formation a little bit better, we can start challenging them to really try and shrink their letters and their words and their writing in general, so that we can get smaller and smaller until they're able to write on those lined papers eventually. So keep in mind that less is more. So this PowerPoint slide, we're going to focus a lot on different tips and tricks and strategies and adjustments that we can make, but less is more. We don't want to just jump in with an adaptive device. We don't want to jump in with an adaptive strategy. We want to try and help our kiddos. If they're struggling with something, we can help them with the least restrictive environment. And then if they continue to struggle with something, that's when we start jumping into adding more adaptations. And my job as an OT is to kind of recognize, okay, they're struggling with this particular task of writing. How can I challenge them so that we can see if we can get them to where they need to be? But I don't want them to get frustrated. I don't want them to start not liking writing. So my job is to jump in at the right time with that adaptation. So hopefully some of these points that we've been touching on kind of give you a little bit more awareness of when adaptation might be necessary when practicing at home. And always feel free to reach out to your child's OT as well. But moving on to the tips and tricks, you can practice understanding big and small lines outside of writing. So just understanding the concept of big versus small with just body movements is great. That's the gross motor GM. So just body movements, my body is getting bigger, my body is getting smaller based on what position you're in. So just making sure they understand that concept in relation to their body, not just like the ball is big, the ball is small, but like in relation to their body. So body awareness, but then also going back to the page, coloring, we're doing big strokes, and we're coloring big. Now we're coloring small. The dog's ball is small. We have to keep our strokes small, so we color inside of the ball. And then also tracing. I already spoke to this a little bit, but I am a big fan of tracing. So using that as a way of, we're tracing the big line, we're tracing the small line kind of stuff. Moving down to individual letter boxes. There's some evidence out there that 3" by 3" for new writers is a good size, and then progressively get smaller. So letter boxes can either be one of two things. You can either have 3" by 3" for each letter, and CAT all goes into that letter box. But if your child needs a little bit of extra support, you can make the letter boxes different sizes. So GO, the letter box is going to go beyond the line, go down. So to show them that they have to go under the line if they're at that point that they're using lines. And CAT, their T is going to have a taller letter box. and C and A. So those are ways of also trying to help kiddos understand how big their letters are and where they go on the line and where they go on the page. Paper strips or window strips. So I'll stop sharing my screen for a second. So these are pretty self-explanatory. Paper strips, you can just cut out a regular piece of paper, draw a line on it. They have to write their word, and you can make it smaller and smaller by cutting it, the lines, cutting it so that way their letters get smaller and smaller, because the child wants to write on the paper. They don't want to get it on the table or whatever. So this kind of helps with that and just gives an extra visual that our letter cannot be the full length of the page because my paper just got very small. And then the window strips, I have a cardboard version of this at the clinic, but cutting out based on how big your child's letters should be based on their age and kind of where they're at, you can make cardboard window strips, and they can lay this flat on the paper, and their letters can't go beyond the cardboard because it's being blocked by the cardboard. So it's just another visual to help kiddos realize just how much space they should be taking up on the page. So back to our card. Small note cards for writing words. That's kind of the same idea. The note cards are small, so buying a bunch of note cards and using those for letter practice would be helpful. Provide visual examples that match what your child needs to reproduce. I'm finding this to be challenging right now with telehealth because I'm not there, but a lot of times kiddos need to see an example of exactly what the writing needs to look like to be able to match the sizing. So just like having something, the dog barked and having that typed out in Times New Roman font, the kiddos aren't going to reproduce that as accurately if they're working on that letter sizing because they don't have that visual example of what it needs to look like. So you as a parent can write out that sentence for them and show them exactly how big their letters should be and give them an example of what it should look like. So the next one is colored lines are using imagery to help the kiddos. So sometimes for different kiddos, they really respond to colors or visual examples, and maybe the top line needs to be red and the bottom line needs to be blue, and that needs to be consistent. And when they're practicing their writing, whether it be letters or words, they always know that the top line is red and the bottom line is blue. Just be careful with that one. I sometimes feel like the paper gets really overwhelming. With that, it works for a lot of kids. You'd be surprised, but for many, it's overwhelming, including myself. So just be careful with that one. And then something that I really like and I use often is using imagery to help kiddos understand that the top line is the top line and the bottom line is the bottom line. And the reason why is the top is the sky and the bottom is the grass. And you can even draw a little sky at the top and draw some grass at the bottom. And oh, we got to go below the grass because the G goes down, down, down deep into the dirt. And then the T is the tall letter. So he goes up and touches the sky, and just using that kind of imagery to help them understand big and small. Reference point at the beginning. Again, this is kind of self-explanatory, but just kind of giving them an anchor point. So I drew some lines. My kiddo needs to write on these lines. They're different sentences. But I drew little hearts at the beginning for all these lines because I want my kiddo to recognize the start of the line versus the end of the line, one line versus the other. You know, a lot of times when kids are having trouble with letter sizing, they're not necessarily recognizing that all these lines are different, and they can't go into this other line with their T. Even though it's a tall letter, it shouldn't go up into the line above, and having kind of a reference point at the beginning helps with that. So sometimes that helps. Go back to our PowerPoint. Oven racks. This only works for certain oven racks, but I've had success with it, that if you have a like really flat one, you can kind of use that to kind of create, you know, it has those wire metal boundaries. So I've had success with that. And I also use oven racks sometimes where kids can scribble back and forth and learn their vertical or horizontal lines, and they can scribble up and down with learning their vertical lines. So sometimes that's helpful too. Wiki Sticks or Woo tape is helpful for learning boundaries, and that kind of, the tape kind of ties into the tactile paper. By no means go out and buy all of this stuff, but they do make different tapes and papers that have the lines, and they have like a tactile graininess to them, so that when kids go above the line or below the line, they kind of feel a little bump in their writing. So they're the lowercase g goes deep down. You're gonna feel it touch over the bump, and you know, it gives a little bit more tactile feedback. And sensory is so important to writing, as we're going to talk about here soon. So the tape and the tactile paper sometimes help with that. I do use it from time to time, but again, don't feel like you have to run out and buy it, because I don't feel like it's super effective for every single kid, but some kids really respond great to it. So chat with your child's OT to see if they think that would be something that your child would benefit from. All right, so our last point that we're going to touch on today, so how to work on handwriting skills without actually writing. Today we're going to talk about multisensory, and future groups will chat about fine motor and gross motor and all that fun stuff. But multisensory is our theme for today. So multisensory gross motor, you could be doing wall balls with the kids. So getting them to move their bodies and feel what the letter feels like in a gross motor space. So you're taking a tennis ball or a slightly bigger ball, and you're writing the letters up against the wall. So nice straight elbow, I'm starting at the top, I'm going to make my A. And if it's too hard for the kiddos to roll the ball along the wall, you can just have them do it out in space, and they don't even have to have anything in their hand, although usually that makes it more fun, as long as they don't get thrown. But feeling what the letter feels like writing it in space. Walking chalk letters. I used to do this all the time, drawing those letters on the ground and then having kids walk heel toe to trace the letters with their bodies. You can do that with painter's tape inside. You can write chalk outside. It's super fun. I used to do a handwriting group, and we would make the letters huge with painter's tape, or we would go outside with chalk, and it would be a bunch of little preschoolers walking around these letters and calling out like frog jump to the top and stuff when they're practicing their letter formation. It was super cute, and it's always a lot of fun, and it's a great balance activity because you're working on that heel toe coordination. Scarf or towel, air letter writing. This is similar to the wall ball, where you can have a scarf or towel and write those letters in the air, and you're doing those big movements again, and the kids are having a lot of fun watching the scarf float through the air as they're making the letter A and B and whatever. So it's a lot of fun. And then dry erase window letters. You can do this on a chalkboard, you can do this on a dry erase board, you can use window markers and do it on your windows. But writing those letters real big on the windows, they're getting a lot of sensory feedback just because they're working against gravity. I love writing on vertical surfaces, and it's a huge thing in the OT world that we don't want to just practice our letters on a horizontal surface, even though that's where we typically write. We want to practice on a vertical surface, get them writing while standing up and writing on these vertical surfaces, because you think about what your arm is doing when you're writing on these vertical surfaces. You're using not just your hand, but you're using your entire upper body. So you're strengthening all of the upper body postural muscles that you need to stabilize. Because writing is very distal. It's happening at the very tip of our fingers, as we think, but really it's the entire body is involved in making this successful. We have to have the core strength and the trunk stability. We have to have the postural control up by our shoulders, and we have to keep our body nice and up and straight so we're not leaning over basically on our paper, and we have to have the elbow control and the wrist control. So there's a lot more to writing other than just what's going on with your 3 special fingers at your graphs pattern. So working on a vertical surface really helps with that, and slant boards are good for that too, but I really like just like tape a piece of paper to the wall and write on that, or get your dry erase board or chalkboard or window markers out and write on that. And dry erase markers actually work really well in windows, so that's like a super cheap option. Everybody has a window, and dry erase markers you can grab at the dollar store. So really cheap option of making a nice big vertical writing surface for your kiddos. And then moving on to the next category, we have the multisensory fine motor. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are just areas that you can play around with your kids, giving them that sensory feedback. Sensory feedback with writing is huge. Our bodies need to recognize what we're doing, and if we can't recognize what our pencil and our fingers are doing, then we're not going to have that proper letter formation, and we're not going to understand it. So giving multisensory opportunities is so big with handwriting. I cannot stress that enough, and that's the reason why I chose to talk about multisensory before fine motor and gross motor. As far as how to work on handwriting without actually doing writing, because it's often not thought about. It's often like, if I strengthen my fine motor skills, my hands are going to get strong, and that's going to help with my writing. If I strengthen my body's going to get strong, and that's going to help with my posture, which is going to help with my writing. But we don't always think of the sensory part of it, but that is like one of the biggest things that we need to think about, because we need the kiddo to understand what their body's doing. And just when we're learning something new that's as complex as writing is, in the beginning, we need to give a lot of sensory input. So writing those letters in shaving cream, writing the letters on just taking a cookie sheet and putting some flour down or sand down and having them write the letters in sand. Play-Doh letters, I love this. My families, especially the ones that are doing telehealth right now, know how much I love Play-Doh and Play-Doh letters. I love rolling out the dough, rolling it into big lines and little lines and big curves and little curves, and creating the letters out of gel. So that's super fun. Chalk letters. Chalk is so simple, and chalk is so good for multisensory handwriting practice. Taking little pieces of chalk and writing, practicing those little tiny, getting your fingers really small and practicing using those little tiny muscles for chalk writing is great. And then taking bigger pieces of chalk and writing the letters huge on the sidewalk. They're getting so much feedback as they're pulling against the cement or the chalkboard or whatever it is. Chalk gives so much extra feedback. The crayons are my favorite thing to write with because they give so much feedback. Chalk is even better. It's a little less convenient because you can't just use regular old paper, but it's even better, and it's so great from a sensory standpoint. Plus, they're getting like the chalk dust on their fingers and stuff, and it becomes a dry tactile activity. Chalk is great. And then hair gel letter packs. This was one of my favorite things to do, fine motor, sensory-wise, with the kiddos. In my handwriting groups, I would take, hair gel that we got at the dollar store. We would get some gallon-size Ziploc bags. We put, squeeze that hair gel into the Ziploc bag. That's a fine motor strengthening activity in and of itself. Then zip up the Ziploc bag, take that Ziploc bag, put it inside of another one because you don't want any spills. You can add glitter in there or whatever you want, food dye, whatever. And then roll the top, tape it up real good with painter's tape or duct tape. And then now you have a gel bag full of this great sparkly dyed gel that the kiddos can write their letters in. And those worked out really, really well. It's pretty cheap, and it's, like I said, it's like a sensory activity, hand strengthening activity in and of itself just to make them. And then lastly, I have finger paint letters here, getting the paint out and painting. You can put a big blob of paint down and have them just paint just with the shaving cream paint make the letters in the paint, or you can have pieces of paper. They have to dip their fingers in the paint and then make the letters on the paper. It's whatever your child responds best to. Both ways are great and helpful. So, like I said, these are not comprehensive lists, but these are just examples to kind of get your brains working. And I will touch on fine motor and gross motor examples in the weeks to come. All right, so this concludes our first group. Again, I'd love to have any questions that you guys have. I would love to hear them. I did include my email here, danielle.zizig@hhcenter.org. So if you do have any questions or anything you want to see in the future from these groups, please don't hesitate to let me know. I am here to help you guys, and I hope this kind of helps a little bit during this time of COVID, where everybody's kind of at home looking for things to help their kiddos with during this time. So this was super fun. I look forward to doing more groups. And I'll see you guys later.